Masechet Zevaḥim Daf Chaf Vav Amar Rabbi Ameh Amar Rabbi Elazar Hi Bifnim V'Ragleha Bachutz Chatach V'Achar Kach Shachat Keshera Shachat V'Achar Kach Chatach Pesula. In order to understand this law of Rabbi Ameh, let's introduce a couple of concepts. Number one, for all korbanot, the shechita, the kabbalah, have to be done within the temple courtyard. For kodesh kodashim, in fact, they have to be done next to the mizbeach. For some of them, it has to be to the north side of the mizbeach. For all korbanot, if the blood is taken outside of the courtyard, then it becomes pasul. And if that blood is then brought back and mixed with blood that had been in the courtyard, then that blood that was taken outside of the courtyard will make the entire mixture pasul. So this is a big problem. So now we're going to be talking about what happens if half of the animal is outside of the courtyard and half of it is inside. Now there's blood that's circulating through the animal, and the half that's outside, the hind legs are outside, so that blood is technically outside of the temple courtyard at the time that one is doing, we're going to start with shechita and then go to kabbalah. And so that would be a problem if you consider that blood that's still in the animal as being the same law as blood. So does it have the status of blood while still in the animal, or only when it comes out of the animal? So Rabbi Ameh teaches that if the animal is inside, most of it, its head is inside, but its legs are outside of the temple courtyard, and then someone cuts off those hind legs, and after that does shechita, then the sacrifice is kosher. The reason is because first he cut off the legs. So now the legs that were outside, there are no legs anymore, so there's no blood in them, and therefore now that there's no legs and no blood circulating in the legs, all of the blood is inside the courtyard, and then you do shechita, then you are sure that all the blood that will come out of the animal is now all inside the courtyard, and therefore the sacrifice is kosher. But the other way around, let's say the animal is whole and the hind legs are outside of the courtyard, and one does shechita and only afterwards cuts off the legs of the animal, it's no good, because at the time of shechita you had some of the blood was in the legs outside of the courtyard, and already that's moving around, and that moved into the body and is going to come out and be in the bowl that you catch the blood with, and therefore some of the blood in the bowl was outside the courtyard and then came back in, and that makes the korban pasul. That's Rabbi Ameh's basic law. Now we have to modify this a bit to take care of the problem of it being a mum, a blemish. Chatach v'achar kach shachat keshera ba'amum kamakrib. You just told me that if you cut off the legs first and then do shechita, it's kosher. But if you cut off the legs, then the animal is blemished, and therefore it's already not a kosher sacrifice. So no legs is not a kosher sacrifice. So how could you say keshera? Ela ema chatach v'achar kach kibel keshera. Kibel v'achar kach chatach pesula. Rather say it like this. You do shechita properly when the animal's inside. That's not a problem. Okay, so we finished shechita, that's all okay. And then you, for Kabbalah, when you want to do Kabbalah, you cut off the animal, you cut off the legs first, and then you receive the blood. That's okay, because the legs that were on the outside, well, you cut them off. So now any blood that was in them is outside, so no blood that was outside came back in, and that's okay. Whereas kibel, if you first receive the blood, well, while the legs are still attached and the legs are half outside, so that means some of that blood is circulating outside the courtyard, then coming back in and going into the blood that you're collecting into the bowl. So that's not good, because if you cut kibel v'achar kach and only then cut them off, then it will be pasul. Okay, so we modified it a bit, and now we understand it's talking about at the time of Kabbalah. You have to cut off the legs first, and only then receive everything in the bowl. חתך ואחר כך קיבל כשרה, והאמר רבי זרע סורם אוזן בבכור ואחר כך קיבל דמו. פסול שנאמר, ולקח מדם הפר, פר שהיה כבד. Hold on, we have to modify the law a little bit more, because if you cut off the legs and then did Kabbalah, would that be okay? We learned yesterday that at the time of Kabbalah also, you cannot have a mum. That's what we saw. The Bizera said, if someone cut the ear of a bechor, while doing shechita, he cuts the ear, and only after it has a cut in the ear, he receives the blood. It's no good, because velakach midam hapad, this pasuk that's talking about Kabbalah says midam hapad. The pad has to be in the same state as it was before, meaning with no blemish. So Kabbalah has to also be without blemish. Therefore, if you cut off the legs first, that's a blemish, and then the Kabbalah will be no good. So therefore, we have to modify the law a little bit more. Amar Rav Chisda, Amar Avimi, chotech be'eber ad shemagia la'atzem. The law of a blemish is that an animal is only is blemished if it's missing the leg altogether, if it has no bone. But as long as the bone is there, even if the flesh is cut off, that's still not considered a blemish. And so therefore, Rav Chisda Amar Abimi says, we're talking about where one cuts the flesh until he reaches the bone. And if you cut off the flesh and all the veins, so there's no blood there. So that's what you have to do. So therefore, you do shechita. And then the animal is half out. And then the one takes the knife and cuts off all the flesh and the veins and the blood that's outside. So that's all gone. And after that, you do Kabbalah, so the animal is not considered blemished, and there is no blood that's going from outside to inside that is going to be mixed up with the blood that is in the bowl, and therefore that is kosher. Whereas if you do it the other way around, if you would first receive the blood, and then, only then, cut off the flesh of the bones, that's no good, because while receiving the blood is circulating still, and some of the blood from that was outside in the legs will come inside and go into the bowl and make it all no good. So now, let's see if we can learn something from this. Another question about it. You just said if you receive the blood first and then cut off the leg, it's no good. Cut off the flesh of the leg. Shmat mina dam hamuvla be'evarim damhu. So should we conclude from this that blood that's in the limbs is considered blood, but that's not true for other laws. If one consumes blood by itself that came out, then that's karet. But if one consumes blood that's absorbed in the limbs, it's not karet. And so generally we don't say that blood that's absorbed in the limbs has the same status as blood, but according to this, the blood that was in the limbs as you were doing Kabbalah is considered blood, and then even when it comes out, since it was outside the courtyard, is considered blood that's outside the courtyard, even though it's absorbed in the limbs. So there's a problem because it goes against the general rule that blood absorbed in the limbs is not considered blood. So the answer to that is Dilma Mishum Shamnunit. No, we're talking about the problem is animal's fat. Animal's fat also cannot be taken outside the courtyard. And the problem is that when the hind legs are outside the courtyard, some of that fat is going to get mixed up into the blood, and the blood will carry some of that fat from outside to inside. And so that's the problem, that fat was outside the courtyard and then came back in, and that's what makes the korban pasul. Shmat mina besar kodashim kalim sheyasa lifnei zirikat dam pasul. Now, Rabbi Amez's law, he did not distinguish between koche kadashim and kadashim kalim. So, should we conclude from here that this applies also to kadashim kalim, that edible flesh that was outside before Zirikat Adam becomes pasul? There's a problem because the general halacha that is going to come up later in the Masechet is that Kodashim Kalim, since Kodashim Kalim can be taken outside the courtyard after Zirikah. Once you do Zirikah, that's it, the animal atoned, and then the rest of the meat, which can be eaten by anyone tahor, can be eaten within the walls of Yerushalayim. So you're permitted to take it outside of the courtyard. So it's definitely permitted after Zirikat Dam. So how about before Zirikat Dam? Well, the accepted halacha that we're going to see later is that even before Zirikat Dam, if it went out, it's still okay. But according to this, if you make no distinction between Kodshe Kadashim and Kadashim Kalim, and you accept the Bi Amez law and the interpretation that we said that's talking about the fat, the edible parts, the fat or the flesh, then that would mean that even for Kodashim Kalim, if the flesh was outside before Zirikat Dam, pasul. But we don't know that for sure. In fact, we generally conclude the opposite. And so the answer is Dilma Bekodesh Kodashim. No, maybe the BMS law is only for Kodesh Kodashim, which cannot be taken out at all. Even after Zerikat Dam, you can't take it out. Even Korban Chatat that the Kohanim eat has to be within the temple courtyard. And so for that, it cannot be taken out, not before Zerikat, not after Zerikah. That's what it's applying to. But this law may not apply to Kodashim Kalim. Tenor Banan, Kodesh Kodashim Shechitatan Basafon. B'kibul daman bichle sharet basafon. Here's a braita very similar to a Mishnah in Masechet Zevaḥim that says Kodesh Kodashim, like Hatat, Ola, they are you do have to do shechita of them in the north, on the north side of the Mizbeach, and you receive the blood also in a holy vessel in the north side. Amad badarom ve'oshit yado lasafon ve'shachat shechitato keshera. As long as the animal is in the north, even if the Kohen doing shechita is in the south, his body's in the south, but he stretches his hand into the north and does shechita, that's okay. The point is the animal has to be in the north, and his hand has to be in the north. Kibel kabalato pesula. But if he is standing in the south and receives the blood by sticking his hand and the bowl out into the north, that is no good. The Kohen himself has to be in the north in order to do Kabbalah. But as long as the Kohen put most of his body into the north, even if his feet are outside, but he's leaning over into the north, then we follow the majority of his body. If the animal, after you did shechita in the north, but then it convulsed, it moves around, just from the electric shocks that are still going through its body, and it went from the north into the south and then came back to the north, that's okay, because as long as you did the initial shechita in the north, it's okay if it jumps back to the south. Let's compare those laws to Kodashim Kalim. Kodashim Kalim, shechitatan bifnim b'kibul daman bichle sharet bifnim. Unlike Kodesh Kodashim, that where you have to do the shechita and the receiving of the blood on the northern side of the Mizbeach, Kodashim Kalim, one can do shechita and receive the blood anywhere within the courtyard, but they both have to be bechle sharet, that you receive the blood. Amad bachus v'chnis yado lifnim v'shachat shechitato keshera. This law is similar, equivalent, in that if the person doing shechita was outside the courtyard, his body, but he reached his hand inside and did shechita inside the courtyard, then that's okay. So that's similar to here, where he's standing in the south, but he reaches his hand in the north. And so shechita is more lenient than Kabbalah, which makes sense because shechita actually does not have to be done by a Kohen. Anybody can do shechita. And so therefore, the point is that the animal has to be in the right place, but the person does not have to be in the right place. Kibel kabalato pesula. If, however, he received the blood while standing outside of the courtyard, reaching his hand inside, that's no good. Which also makes sense because Kabbalah has to be done by a Kohen, and has to be a Kohen wearing the Bigdei Kehuna with his feet on the floor in the right place, and so he has to be himself in the right place. And that's true if he has to be in the north. If he's in the south, it's no good because the reception has to be in the south. So the reception has to be in the north. So he has to be in the north. Here in Kodashim Kalim, the reception has to be in the courtyard, so he has to be in the courtyard. Here, however, there's a difference. Whereas in the first case of Kodashim Kalim, if he is mostly in the north, then that's okay. The reason is because mostly he's in the north, and the rest of him is still in the courtyard. So his feet are still on the floor of the courtyard, and most of his body is in the north, so that's sufficient. But if his feet here, in the second case, are outside of the courtyard, even if he's leaning in, and most of his body is inside the courtyard, it's as if he's not, because his feet are not on the floor of the courtyard. It's like he's not totally dressed. It's like his feet are not on the floor. Even if he's in the courtyard, standing on top of a vessel, it's no good. So this is worse. So that explains that difference. In this case is also different. If after you do shechita, it convulses and leaves the courtyard and comes back in, it's no good. That's different from up here. Up here, you have to do shechita in the north and Kabbalah in the north. Good. So you did that. Now it ran around, but it's still in the courtyard. So it's not going to become disqualified because it's still at least in the courtyard, and you did those essential services in the north, so you're good. But over here, in this case, once the services have to be in the courtyard, it ran outside the courtyard. Well, that's going to be pasul. Okay, so that explains that baraita. We brought all this as a question to that statement that we had, the topic that we were just talking about. Shema mina besar kodashim kalim she'asad lifnei zirikat damim pesulim. From this last line, we could conclude that flesh, even of kodashim kalim, that is taken outside or leaves the courtyard, even before Zirikat Tamim, because Zirikat Tamim is pasul. But this is a challenge because we said the established halacha is that since Kodashim Kalim can be eaten anywhere in Jerusalem after Zirika, therefore, even if it leaves before Zirika, it's not going to be pasul. But over here, it says that the animal that leaves is going to be pasul. So why? If that the established understanding is not so. And the answer is Dilma when it says pisulim, it's not all the flesh that's going to be eaten. The flesh that will be eaten, that actually, if it goes out of the courtyard, still okay. But rather, we're talking about the parts of a kodashim kalim, like a korban shilamim. Parts of it still go on the mizbeach. Those parts are treated like kodesh kodashim. The tail, the diaphragm, the two kidneys. If those parts go out of the courtyard before zirika, then the whole thing is going to be pasul, and so we can still we can say that and still stick with the normative position that for kodashim kalim, if the flesh that you eat goes outside the courtyard before zirika, that's still okay. Abu Shmuel Mishmuel. He bifnim v'ragleha b'chutz mahu. The father of Shmuel asked his son Shmuel a series of questions. Some of them are a little bit tricky. The first one is, what happens if most of the animal is inside the courtyard, but the legs of the animal are outside, and you do shechita? What's the law? And Shmuel gave the correct answer. Well, it says in the pasuk, ve'bi'um laHashem, you have to bring them to Hashem. That means the entire korban has to be brought to Hashem and entirely be inside. Now, beforehand, we did talk about a case where the legs were sticking out, but that could be lechatechila. It could be that this is lechatechila. It should be entirely inside. B'diavad, the legs are outside. And then we ended up saying that law from Rabbi Ameh was talking about actually the Kabbalah. So you can try to reconcile these and not say that Shmuel is arguing with Rabbi Ameh. In any case, the korban should lechatechila be entirely inside. That's the last correct answer that the son Shmuel is going to have. The next question, Tala v'shachat mahu. What if someone suspended the animal in the air? You hung it from a hook, from a crane, and it's hanging in the air, and someone who's standing on the floor does shechita. What's the law? Amar le keshera. Well, it should be no problem because it's in the right place. It's in the courtyard, so it should be okay. Amar le ishtabasht b'ainan shechita al yarech veleka. And the father of Shmuel says, no, you made a mistake. The shechita has to be at the side of the altar, near the altar. And if it's hanging in the air, that's not called near the altar. It has to be on the floor near the altar. And therefore, an animal suspended in the air for at least this type of korban is not good. This is from Vayikra chapter 1, talking about a korban olah. Nitla v'shachat mahu. What if the kohen was suspended in the air? So he's hanging from a rope, and he does shechita while the animal is lying on the floor. So what do you think about that? The father asked the son. Amar le pesula. And Shmuel says, well, the previous case was pesula, because he said kesherah, but it was corrected pesula. So the hanging animal is pesula. So I guess he's figuring that, well, if the kohen is hanging, maybe also pesula. Amar le ishtabash. And the father says, no, you made a mistake again. Shechita al yarech velo shochet al yarech. We only need that the korban has to be next to the altar on the floor, but the shochet does not have to be. And this is significant because, again, the shochet doesn't even have to be a kohen. So as long as the shechita is being done, the animal has to be in the right place, but the kohen, the person doing shechita, doesn't even have to be a kohen. He doesn't have to have his feet on the floor. That's okay. Nitla v'kibel mahu. Next question the father asks, what if the Kohen, this has to be a Kohen, is hanging from the air and he does Kabbalah? What about that? Amar le keshera. Shmuel says, well, you just said a law about the person hanging in the air and it's okay. So he says, well, I guess it's okay. Amar le ishtabash en derech shirut bekach. However, the father says, nope, mistaken again. The way of doing a service is not like that, hanging from the air. The Kabbalah already has to be an official service by a Kohen, wearing Bigdei Kohen Gadol, with his feet on the floor. He's hanging in the air. That's not a normal way of doing service, so no good. Tala v'kibel mahu. What if they suspended the animal in the air? It's fine. The animal has to be on the floor for shechita. Then you lifted it up on a crane, and then you did Kabbalah while it's hanging from the air. How about that? Amar le pisula. Shmuel says, oh, I guess no good. Amar le ishtabash. Shmuel says, sorry, mistaken again. Shechita al yarech v'lo Kabbalah al yarech. Only shechita has to be next to the mizbech, but the Kabbalah does not have to be next to the mizbech, and therefore it can be in the air. Even though it's in the air, it's still within the courtyard. So that's still considered in the courtyard or in the right place, wherever it has to be, even if it has to be in the north. So in the airspace of the north, it still is called the north. So that's okay. So it's fine. And only for shechita do we have also next to the mizbech. Next to the mizbech, that law has to be on the floor. But for the kohen, for Kabbalah, if it's hanging in the air, the animal hanging in the air, then that is okay. Amar Abaye, bekodshe kadashim kulan pesulot bar niditla v'shachat. Abaye says, I disagree a little bit. If he's making a distinction when it comes to kodshe kodashim, and if you do anything in the air, it's no good. Except for if the Kohen is hanging in the air and he does shechita. Because that's the least important. It doesn't even have to be done by a Kohen. So anyone who's doing shechita, he could be hanging in the air and he could do shechita. That one is okay, but anything else is pasul. The animal always has to be on the floor, and the Kohen has to be certainly on the floor in order to do Kabbalah. However, bekodashim kalim, kulam kesherot, bar min nitla v'kibel. If it comes to kodashim kalim, all these cases are permitted, except for if the Kohen was in the air and he was doing Kabbalah. That one is no good, because that's an official service, and the Kohen's feet have to be on the floor. That's not the way to do Kabbalah. But any of the other ones, for Kodashim Kalim, the airspace is the same as the floor. And so for Kodashim Kalim, there's no law that it has to be next to the Mizbeach, Al Yarech, and therefore it can be in the airspace of the courtyard. The animal can be in the airspace of the courtyard. There's no problem with that. Amar Rava, Ma'ishana Tala v'kiba bekodashim kalim dechshera, David pinim kefnim dameh. Rava disagrees yet again. He says, why, how come you made a difference and said that if you put the animal in the air and did Kabbalah in Kadashim Kalim, it's okay? You must be because you think that airspace is like this airspace of the courtyard is the same as being in the courtyard. Bekodashe Kodashim Nameh, Avir Safon Kesafon Dameh. Well, then you should say the same thing for Kodshe Kodashim. Those have to be not only in the courtyard, but on the northern part. Okay, so if it's hung in the northern part, then it should still be okay. And therefore you should be able to do Kabbalah if the animal is hanging. Shechita not, because Shechita has to be Al Yarech. But Kabbalah can be hanging in the air. Ela marava ben bekodshe kodashim ben bekodashim kalim kesherot bar min tala v'shachat bekodshe kodashim nidla v'kibel ben bekodshe kodashim ben bekodashim kalim. So Rava has yet another opinion and says whether it's kodshe kodashim or kodashim kalim, all these cases are kosher except for if you hung the animal up and did shechita in Kodshe Kodashim, because that has to be next to the Mizbech, and next to the Mizbech means on the floor. And also, if the Kohen was hung up and did receiving of the blood, that is also no good in any Korban, Kodshe Kodashim or Kodshe Kodashim Kalim, because for Kabbalah, it has to be done by a Kohen, properly dressed, feet on the floor, in order to do it in the proper way. Who bifni v'sisit b'chutz mahu? Hu. And Rabbi Meir asked Rabbi Zera, what if the Kohen isn't, his entire body is inside, but his fringes of his hair are outside of the courtyard? How about that? Just a fringe outside, is that significant? Amar le, lava amart evi'um la Hashem ad shetavo kula lifnim. And he said, oh, didn't you already say the pasuk that you bring it to Hashem? That means that everything has to be inside. That was referring to the korban, but we're going to apply that to the kohen also. It says when the kohanim come to Ohel Moed. That means when their entirety comes, that includes their whole body and includes also their hair fringes have to be inside the courtyard. The next Mishnah teaches, Netano al gabe hakevesh shelo keneged hayesod. Natane tani tanin lemata lema'la. Vetani tanin lema'la lemata. Vetani tanin bifnim bachutz. Vetani tanin bachutz bifnim pasul ve'en bo karet. The blood that the kohen sprinkles on the mizbech is supposed to be in a certain spot. If you put it in the wrong spot, then although it's pasul, however, there is no karet. So let's go through each one. If the kohen put the blood, instead of on the mizbech itself, he puts it on the ramp. Well, it's not the right place, but at least it's going somewhere. If he put it on the mizbeach, but not in a place where there is a foundation. This bottom level foundation doesn't go all the way around. It only goes part of the way around. So you're supposed to put it on a wall that has a foundation under it. If you put it on an area of the wall that has no foundation under it, that's not the right place. Some korbanot, you have to put the blood above the red line, others below the red line. If it's below, supposed to be below, and you put it above, or the other way around. Or if something is supposed to be sprinkled inside the hechal, in the kodesh, like on the mizbach haketoret, and you sprinkled it outside, or if it's supposed to be outside and you sprinkle it inside, pasul, the korban is pasul. However, one does not get karet because at least it's somewhere on the mizbeach. Amar Shmuel, pasul basar, ava ba'alim nitkaperu. Shmuel explains, when we say pasul, it doesn't mean that the korban totally is pasul. It's just the meat is pasul for consumption. If it's a korban hatat, for example, then the kohanim are supposed to eat the rest of the meat, some of the meat. No, but if it's sprinkled in the wrong place, then they cannot eat the meat. However, even though sprinkled in the wrong place, the owner who brings that korban hatat receives atonement. So actually the korban itself is kosher. It's a valid korban, but because you did sprinkle the blood somewhere on the mizbeach, but because it's not in the right place, only the meat cannot be eaten. That's all. My ta'ama, damar kera, v'ani netativ lachem al mizbeach lechaper, kevan shegia adam lemizbeach netkaperu be'alim. Pasuk says, I have given it to you upon the altar to atone. Upon the altar means anywhere on the altar, as long as the blood reached the altar somewhere, lechaper, you already get kapara. And so the kapara is easier to get. That's anywhere, but the meat is prohibited from eating. We ask, well, if it achieves atonement, then why not say that the meat also is kosher? Because the pasuk says, if it's on the mizbech, you get atonement. Atonement, yes, but not other things. Other things means not the meat. The meat is not kosher. Okay, so now we can see that, based on Shmuel's opinion, that blood that's sprinkled not in the right place, it's like it's in the right place. At least for atonement, it's okay. It's the same thing. But is that true? We have another Mishnah later on. Tanan be'idach pirkin in the next perek. Netano al hakebesh. שלא כנגד היסוד. נתן תניתנין למטה למעלה, ונתנין למעלה למטה, ותניתנין בפנים בחוץ, ותניתנין בחוץ בפנים. אם יש דם הנפש, יחזור הכשר ויקבל. That Mishnah is very similar to this Mishnah. Also, if one puts the blood on the ramp, or not in a place where there's a foundation, or if it's supposed to be below and you put it above, or above and you put it below, or it's supposed to be inside, you put it outside, or suppose outside and you put it inside, if there's still more blood of the nefesh, the animal, you just did shechita, the blood is squirting out, a kohen took some of that blood, put it in the wrong place. If it's still squirting out, hurry up, go back, get more blood, from dam nefesh and go ahead and put it on the mizbeach in the right place. Yachzor hakasher, somewhat a kohen that's fit for doing so should do it again, and then it will be okay. Now, if you say that not being in the right place is like the right place for atonement, which is what we just said, then why do you have to go back and do it again? You did it already. You got atonement. And maybe you'll say, yeah, the first sprinkling that was in the wrong place, that got atonement. But we're going to go back and do it again so that the meat can be eaten. But that can't be either, because you never have a case where you don't need to do zirikah. The zirikah is not achieving atonement. The second zirikah is not achieving atonement because you already got atonement from the first one. So the second one, if it's not doing atonement, then it's also not going to permit the meat. You can only permit the meat with a proper zirikah in the right place, and then that zirikah, at the same time, it gives atonement and permits the meat. It has to come together. You never have a case where, oh, you did one zirikah, that's for atonement. And then the second zirikah will not be for atonement, but it will permit the meat. There's no such thing. And therefore, why are you bothering to do the second atonement? Why are you going back to do the second sprinkling? It's not going to help anything. If you think the first one was okay, then why are you doing the second one? And we answer, you're right. If a kohen who was a proper kohen did the first one, just in the wrong place, you're right. Then we would say it's like, even though it's in the wrong place, it's like in the right place for atonement, and he achieved atonement, and there's no point in doing it again. But the Mishnah in the next perek that we quoted, we're talking about a case where a kohen who is not fit did it. So there's actually two problems. It's an improper kohen, and also he put it in the wrong place. Okay, so because there's two problems, that's why it does not affect atonement at all, and that's why we say, oh, go back, get a proper kohen, because it makes sense, because the Mishnah says a proper kohen should go and get more blood. That means that the first one was improper. That's why our Mishnah here above is talking about a proper kohen and puts it in the wrong place, that you get atonement. But an improper kohen, then you don't get atonement. Go and do it again. Wait a second. If an improper kohen did it, then the korban should be totally rejected, permanently rejected, and you shouldn't be able to go back and get more blood and do it again. Ditnan, because we have the same Mishnah teaches. The Mishnah teaches that, and all these people, unfit people, that received the blood, with having in mind that it will be used outside the time or in the wrong place. If they did that, then if there is still more blood, that dam nefesh that's coming out, then a kosher, valid kohen can go and do it again. That teaches that Kabbalah, yes, Kabbalah, you can go back and do it again. But zirikah, if an improper kohen did zirikah, then you cannot go back and do it again, because the Mishnah only says Kabbalah and not zirikah. So therefore, see that if he improper kohen did zirikah, it's no good permanently. Why? Is it not because improper kohen doing zirikah is permanently rejected, and therefore in this case it should be permanently rejected? Isn't this the correct inference that we could make from the Mishnah? Kabbalah in zareku la. We're going to say no. There's other the Mishnah didn't want to exclude zirikah, rather la mishum de pesil machshava. The problem here isn't just that he is an improper kohen, it's that also he has improper intent. That's why it's no good. Improper kohen having improper intent, he's thinking that's going to be used outside the time or outside the place. That's why it's rejected. If he does zirikah, if the improper kohen with improper intent does zirikah, that's why it's rejected. But if he had proper intent, then it would be okay. Now we ask about that. Wait, if he had improper intent and improper kohen, then Kabbalah also would be completely rejected and you wouldn't be able to do it again. That's one question. Another question, ve'od, mi pasla machshava, does improper thought disqualify when you have an improper kohen also? ואמר רבא, אין מחשבה מועלת אלא במי שראוי לעבודה, ובדבר שראוי לעבודה, ובמקום הראוי לעבודה. We only take into account intent, meaning intent is only going to ruin the situation if it's talking about a person that is proper to do avodah, and he's doing using an item that's fit to do avodah with, and in a place that's fit to do avodah. But if you don't have everything else lined up, and so if you have everything else lined up, and then if the only problem is machshava, then machshava is going to be a problem. But if you have other problems regarding the person, the place, or what he's doing, what he's using, then that problem is the main problem, and the machshava is not going to come into account. And therefore, since over here talking about an improper kohen, it doesn't matter if he has improper intent. The main problem is it's an improper kohen. So therefore, you can't say that it's rejected only because it's unfit and he has wrong intention. The wrong intention won't even come into play. So therefore we say, okay, the inference that you just made is not correct. La tema zarkula, ela ema shahatula. When the Mishnah says that if the unfit, improper kohen received it, then you can go back and do it again. But there's another case that you cannot do it again. It wasn't coming to say that zidika, you can't do it again because it's permanently rejected. No, zidika, you can make it up, go do it again. It was talking about shechita. If shechita is done in the wrong way, then it's totally bad. You cannot do it again. My kamash malan de pasla machshava tanena lefichach hen postin b'machshava. In that case, if it's coming to exclude shechita, what is it teaching us? It's teaching us that an unfit kohen who has improper thoughts, that will make the korban rejected. But I don't need that Mishnah to teach us to this law because I have another Mishnah on 31b that says that therefore posin b'machshava. Therefore, and it lists unfit people, unfit for to do service, and if they have also a machshava, wrong intention, then the korban becomes rejected. So I already know that. I wouldn't need this Mishnah to teach us the same thing. And the answer is hakamash mala. No, I do need it. It has to teach us something else. Dimikabala ve'elach la pasla machshava. Ma'itama kederava. That this law of rejection only applies to shechita. If you have an unfit person who is doing shechita with improper thought, then the korban is rejected. However, starting from Kabbalah and Holacha and Zidika, from those on, if an unfit person has wrong intention, it does not make it rejected. Why? Because of what Rava said. Rava says that improper thought only counts and only will make it a rejected korban if everything else is lined up and you have a proper person, proper kohen doing it. Then machshava will make it rejected. But ironically, if you have two problems, it's actually better. If you have an unfit kohen having wrong machshava, well then the unfit kohen, because he's unfit, he doesn't even rise to the level of being able to have improper thought. So his improper thought doesn't even count because he's not even a proper person to be able to effectuate it, and therefore his improper thought will not reject it. Baruch Adonai Le'olam. Amen ve'amen.